All right, let's jump right into this explainer. I'll be your professor today as we unpack an absolute cornerstone document for our Readings in Philippine History course, Antonio Pigafetta's First Voyage Around the World. Today, we're going to strip away centuries of myths surrounding the 1521 Magellan expedition. We'll be analyzing this crucial primary source at a university level, zooming in specifically on the events that led right up to the monumental Battle of Mactan. Our roadmap for this session is pretty straightforward. First, we'll look at the context of the expedition. Then we'll dive into the initial encounters and native alliances. After that, we'll cover the defiance at Mactan, break down the actual anatomy of the battle, and finally evaluate our primary source. Starting off with Section 1, Context of the Expedition, driven by God, gold, and glory. Now, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition was fueled by the age of exploration and that Spanish imperial system of Patronato Real. The goal? To find the wealthy Spice Islands and spread the Catholic faith. But before any of those grand ambitions could even be realized, they had to survive. And the reality of 16th century maritime travel was, frankly, brutal. Listen to this primary source quote from Pigafetta. "We ate biscuit, which was no longer biscuit. It stank strongly of the urine of the rats." That really paints a visceral picture, doesn't it? It perfectly illustrates the horrific starvation and scurvy the crew suffered just trying to cross the Pacific Ocean. Our focus really begins right at the tail end of that grueling Pacific crossing. In March 1521, they hit the Ladrones Islands, which, by the way, Pigafetta judged quite harshly through his European lens. Shortly after, they arrived in the Philippine archipelago at Homonahan. It's here that Pigafetta documents their very first peaceful encounters, including a crucial blood compact with Raja Colombo. This ultimately culminated in the first Catholic Mass at Limasawa, a massive moment of cultural introduction before the Spanish packed up and moved on to the much richer port of Cebu. Moving right along to Section 2, Encounters and Native Alliances. Basically, the complex politics of 1521. What's absolutely fascinating here is the stark contrast in motivations the second they reached Cebu. You have Magellan demanding Christian conversion, tribute, and Spanish vassalage. But on the other side, Raja Humabon wasn't just passively accepting a new religion. No, he was playing some incredibly shrewd local geopolitics. In this wild historical twist, Humabon essentially utilized the Spanish and their terrifying European firearms as his own personal mercenaries. He wanted to use them to subjugate local rival chiefs who were refusing to bow to his authority. Which naturally brings us to Section 3, Defiance at Mactan and Lapu-Lapu's stand. So the crucial takeaway here is that Lapu-Lapu, the chief of a settlement on the neighboring island of Mactan, wasn't just some defiant warrior acting out of pure emotion. He was a highly strategic chieftain actively protecting his commercial interests. You see, Mactan controlled a very strategic harbor, which allowed Lapu-Lapu to intercept trading vessels headed for Cebu. Historical accounts actually suggest Lapu-Lapu was perfectly willing to pay some tribute to Magellan, but he absolutely drew the line at kissing Humabon's hand or recognizing Humabon as his overlord. This was a deep, complex local power struggle, and Magellan carelessly stepped right into the middle of it. And Pigafetta actually tells us the exact spark that ignited the whole conflict. Another Mactan chief, a guy named Zula, essentially baited Magellan. Zula sent over a tribute of 2 goats, but claimed he couldn't send the full amount because Lapu-Lapu was standing in his way. So Zula asked Magellan for just one single boatload of men to help defeat Lapu-Lapu. Well, Magellan took the bait. Looking to prove Spanish military superiority once and for all, he decided to go himself, bringing 3 boatloads of men instead of 1. Let's break down Section 4, Anatomy of the Battle. Honestly, it was a complete tactical disaster. In the early hours of April 27, 1521, things fell apart fast. And you really have to ask yourself, why in the world did an experienced Portuguese commander risk his men against such impossible odds? According to Pigafetta, the Mactan warriors numbered around 1,500. Magellan brought 60 men total, but left 11 behind just to guard the boats, meaning he took only 49 guys into the actual fight. The primary source text reveals exactly why. Magellan was wildly, dangerously overconfident. He was so incredibly sure of his technological superiority that he actually, politely, declined Raja Humabon's offer to send indigenous warriors to fight alongside him. Magellan literally told Humabon to just stay in his boats and watch the bravery and fighting power of the Europeans. Classic hubris. But the geography doomed them before a single shot was even fired. They arrived few hours before dawn, but because of the low tide and jagged coral rocks, the Spanish boats couldn't get anywhere near the shore. That meant their heavy ship artillery completely out of range and useless. Because of this, the heavily armored Spaniards were forced to leap into the water and wade 3 crossbow flights, which is nearly a kilometer. Imagine the severe exhaustion setting in before they even set foot on the beach where Lapu-Lapu's men were waiting. This breaks down the fatal tactical mismatch that Pigafetta witnessed. Magellan divided his exhausted men and they fired their arquebuses and crossbows for a solid half hour, but it was largely ineffective at that distance. The Mactan warriors had light wooden shields and sprang nimbly from side to side, easily dodging the fire. And here's the brilliant part. The indigenous warriors quickly figured out that the European armor protected their heads and torsos, but left their legs totally exposed. So what did they do? They concentrated their terrifying barrage of poisoned arrows, iron-tipped bamboo lances, and stones directly at the Spaniards' unarmored legs. Step by step, we see the European formation completely collapse. Desperate to create a distraction, Magellan ordered some of his men to torch the local houses. This backfired spectacularly. It only enraged the natives even further. Then, Magellan himself was struck by a poisoned arrow right in the leg. As he ordered a slow retreat, the sheer numbers overwhelmed them. He was hit in the face with a bamboo spear, and finally a scimitar struck his left leg, bringing him face down into the water, where he was killed. Now, it's really important to notice Pigafetta's bias here. He notes with deep sorrow how Magellan kept turning back to see if his men were safe, deliberately portraying his fallen captain as this selfless martyr to the very end. Despite the legendary, almost mythological status this battle has taken on, the total death toll for Magellan's side was surprisingly small. Only 8 Europeans and 4 Christian natives actually died that day. But the psychological blow, that was massive. The aura of European invincibility was permanently shattered in those waters. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, evaluating the primary source, specifically focusing on Pigafetta's lens. To truly grasp this event, we have to put on our historian hats and evaluate the primary source itself. Pigafetta's journal is an absolute treasure. Today, there are only 4 rare manuscript copies that have survived. It gives us an incredible chronological timeline and some truly invaluable ethnographic observations of pre-colonial Philippine society. But, and this is a massive source limitation we have to remember, it is filtered entirely through a 16th century Eurocentric and deeply religious perspective. Pigafetta didn't fluently speak the local languages, and his grasp of those complex indigenous political networks was incredibly limited. And look at this glaring limitation of the source. For a man who has become a literal national hero, Pigafetta tells us absolutely nothing about Lapu-Lapu's actual role during the battle. We have no idea if he fought on the front lines or directed troops from the rear. In fact, right after this event, Lapu-Lapu vanishes entirely from the historical record. Almost everything we think we know about him outside of this tiny mention is essentially later speculation or pure legend. This is exactly why, as historians, we can really rely on just a single primary source to give us the whole picture. We must constantly triangulate the strengths of a source against its limitations. Pigafetta gives us vivid, ground-level details of the battlefield, sure, but we have a complete and total lack of direct records from the Mactan side. Think about that for a second. We are hearing the story of Lapu-Lapu's great victory exclusively from the perspective of the people he defeated. Which brings us to the very core of historical analysis. I want to leave you with this thought to chew on. If our primary window into this monumental cultural clash was written entirely by the colonizer, how much of the true indigenous reality, their real motives, their brilliant tactics, their entire worldview, are we still missing today? Can we ever truly accept a single eyewitness account as the complete historical truth? Keep questioning the narrative, keep investigating those sources, and I'll see you in our next session.